After I came home from church last night, I was sitting at the kitchen table having a little dinner, and had the shade open, and I saw what looked like a very bright star, and it kept getting brighter and brighter, and finally I realized that it was moving, and then I realized it started to change colors, and so I went outside in the backyard, and as I stood there in the backyard, this object came out of the sky. It was really big, shiny, looked like maybe a saucer of some kind. It landed in my backyard, and these very short guys came out, about this tall, smooth skin, kind of a green complexion, big head, large eyes, and we had a little conversation. I invited them inside for some food. They didn't want to go inside. They were scared to enter my dwelling place, so I took them out to dinner, and we went to Tommy's. We had some pie, shared a malt, talked about, stuff you talk about with those people. Drove them back to my house, escorted them to their spaceship. They got in their spaceship. It hovered over the backyard for a while and then zoomed back into space. Last night this happened. They say that familiarity breeds contempt. And one guy once put it this way: it's not that it always breeds contempt, but it certainly takes the edge off of admiration. And it is something, I think, of what Jesus was trying to communicate in Matthew 11 when he said, it's the prophet that doesn't have any honor where? In his hometown. See, in his own hometown, it's a problem, because this great, powerful person who is a spokesman for God, well, if you get too familiar with him, if you know where he, lives, and you know his siblings, and you know where he has lunch every Tuesday afternoon, then he becomes less ominous, and it's just not all that impressive anymore, because there's that sense of familiarity. Well, the same kind of thing, I think, can be said to be true about great Bible doctrines. There are great Bible doctrines that are really they're mind-blowing. They're astounding truths. Truths like God from another dimension in some strange abode called heaven, who exists in some weird, incomprehensible, unapproachable light, who this being that's so immense that we could never comprehend him. He's actually come and visited the earth for 33 years and encapsulated himself in a body, and some guy that's maybe, 5'10" and 170 pounds, brown eyes, beard, sandals, likes to wear earth tones. This person is really God. That is the doctrine of the incarnation. And it is a mind-boggler. But the problem is, I can talk about the incarnation, and you guys can yawn your way through it. And you can say, yeah, I know about that. You can hear it, and you do hear it all the time, being well-versed Sunday school graduates. You've studied it. You've memorized verses about it. You, of course, every season of every Christmas season, every year, you get exposed again to all the songs about God coming to earth. And you have nativity sets on your neighbor's front lawn. You've got Christmas cards that come with pictures of Bethlehem and a nativity scene. And oh yeah, God came to earth. And I can say that in church, that God came to earth in the person of Christ, and nobody gasps, and there's not anybody passing out, and no wrinkled eyebrows, no mystery, no curiosity, no wonder. It's just, oh yeah. I think that's a travesty when Christians don't fall at the amazing, astounding, overwhelming truths of Scripture, such as God became a man. That's an incomprehensible thought. And it's one that deserves our attention, and it really should invoke some wonder in our lives. We ought to be amazed by it. We ought not dare go through another Christmas season where we see the nativity set and the little Christmas pageants and the plays and the Christmas cards and hear the Christmas carols at the mall and forget that this is a huge claim. Now, I wasn't visited by aliens last night, but that got at least your attention a little bit more than if I got up here and said, I want to teach about God becoming a man. You'd go, okay, how long is that sermon going to be? But tell me more about your alien encounter. I mean, that's interesting. What happened there? But do you understand that for me to claim that Christ was God in human form, That actually God visited the planet and lived for 33 years, almost 2,000 years ago now. He had a 33-year life and a ministry that was recorded in 4 biographies focusing on the last 3 years of his life. That if I could tell you that was really God incarnate, that ought to there ought to be some wrinkled brows. There ought to be some jaws that hit the laps of people here, because that's an amazing thing. The incarnation. It's it's a compound word of 2 Latin words, in, which creatively means in, and the word carnalis in Latin, and it means, it's come into languages like Spanish, and we have words like carne, like chili con carne, and carne asada burrito. Please, Mr. Pedro. We have these phrases in our language, and we know what carne means. It means meat, right? The incarnation is the doctrine, the amazing, unbelievable doctrine that God, who dwells in unapproachable light, this immense transcendent being that none of us could ever know and perceive on our own, has actually put on meat. He's walked around in human flesh, in a body yea high, in a frame with a skeleton, with veins and arteries, who ate and drank and walked and talked. This person was not just a person. According to the Bible, he was God. And it didn't just start that he stepped into this dimension as a man. He was actually conceived in a microscopic way in the womb of a virgin girl named Mary. And God at one point was a fetus. Can you imagine? That God was one day born in a dusty stable and coddled in the arms of a young teenage girl named Mary, and right there in that 8-pound package was God who'd put on flesh. If we can hear that and not be utterly amazed at that, then something's wrong. And the point about every amazing doctrine of the Bible is the amazing doctrines, they require a purposeful response. Truth always demands a response. And these kinds of truths ought to demand a real, purposeful response. We ought to respond in some clear and dramatic way. If that baby in Bethlehem was really God. Thus the title of our message this morning. I want to start this morning looking at some dramatic statements in Colossians chapter 1, beginning in verses 15 and going through verse 20 is what we'll cover in the next few weeks. Today, just the first 8 words. That's why you didn't get a memory card, by the way, because 8 words, my goodness. You can memorize that right now, right? There are 8 words in this small portion of Scripture, the first half of verse 15 that I want to look at. And every time a new nuance of truth shows up in this song that is written, this prose, this poem that's written in the middle of this letter to the Colossians, I want to stop and ask ourselves the question, if that truth is true, as we hold it up and examine it, the question will be for the next few weeks, what should my response to that be? What should my response be if that child in Bethlehem is literally and really God in human form? What should I do? I mean, here I sit 2,000 years later. Should that have any effect on my life now? Well, that's what I want to do. So look at the first 8 words with me this morning, and let's examine these words and how Paul puts it. And if we really take time to let these words sink in, you'll realize this is a pretty dramatic statement being made. Look at it with me. Colossians 1:15. The text says, He is, and again the context is the Son that He loves. We're talking about Christ here. That Christ is, circle 2 words here. The first one is image. He is the image, the second word is, of the invisible, circle the word invisible, God. He is the image of the invisible God. Now, if you haven't already noticed it, when you circled it, can you draw a line from one word to the next and realize that those are contradictory terms? Right? It doesn't make any sense. He is the image of the invisible God. And there's a bit of the mystery of what we're about to talk about for the next half hour. He is the image. You know what an image is? Image is something I can see. He is the image of the invisible God. What do you mean? I thought God was invisible. He is invisible. As a matter of fact, in the Old Testament, God was so concerned that people remember that He could not be encapsulated in any kind of image, that He was very down on images. You know that, right? Images were a bad thing. You don't want any images if you're going to worship Yahweh of the Old Testament. You want to worship the real creator of heaven and earth? Don't get images involved in it. Images are bad. Not only in the 10 Commandments do we have right out of the gate a command that you're not to worship anybody but the real God. The next thing we say is don't put any of this into images. You don't want images. And we couldn't even get out of Exodus before the people disobeyed that command, and they started making things like a golden calf. Now, if you know the context of that, you know that they were trying to worship the real God through this image. They wanted to use that image because they wanted something to hang on to, so that image was going to be something they used to worship God. And you know what God thought about that, right? He sent Moses down the hill, says, pulverize it, crush it, grind it up, put it in the water, make them drink it. I don't like this at all. I mean, it's a bizarre passage. But he says, I don't want you putting me in an image. And we like this. Even the phrase today, we say, don't put God in a box. Well, all of a sudden, in this passage, God is in a box, right? God is in a human form. He's in flesh. He's in skin. He's got hair growing out of the top of his head. He's a person all of a sudden. He is the image, something now we can see of the invisible God. Something has happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. All this prohibition against images, all this prohibition against, don't you get something that you visibly focus on. Don't get any kind of thing that you use to where all of a sudden now God shows up on the scene, 5'10", 170 pounds, and says, I'm God. And all of a sudden we have God in human form. And you know, from the very beginning, when he was just a 7-pound baby in the arms of Mary, it was clear that God was making it obvious to people that this is God. Because the first natural response, if God shows up in your neighborhood, you know what the natural response, the first and obvious response ought to be? It ought to be the response of the Magi. The Magi showed up. They said, we've seen his star in the east, and we have come to what? Worship him. You see, if God's going to show up in our world, we're going to go, and we're going to bow down, and we're going to say, God is here. We worship you. First thing on your outline, it is the most obvious thing. But it is something that I think you need to realize is a mind-blowing, unique, and creative thing to say. We ought to worship Jesus unreservedly. And by that I mean there's a prohibition against worshiping images. And now all of a sudden I'm saying, here is an image. He's the image of the invisible God. Worship him. That's the natural response if God shows up in an image on the planet. Unreservedly worship him. Say, okay, now I know. You've told me for centuries, don't worship an image. Now all of a sudden the image of God is here. What do we do with that? Well, we worship it. We worship him. Now, worshiping a person, hopefully, I hope you recognize as people who innately know God and he's spirit. And I hope you realize that's an odd thing to do, right? If I said, you know what, Dan is such a great pastor. You know, Dan is so great. He's so godly. We're going to bring him up right now. Dan, come on up. And we're going to sit Dan right here and say, okay, Dan, we're going to sing some worship songs to you now. Oh, Dan, we love you. We worship and adore you. Glorify your name in all the earth. Can you see that? No, you can't see that. I can't see that. That's crazy. We're going to worship Dan because Dan is a person. You don't worship people. If I said, no, okay, all right, that is kind of a stretch. Let's worship Moses. I mean, he's a really godly guy. Let's worship Moses. Right? Moses, we love. Can you see that either? Doesn't make any sense. But all of a sudden, I'm saying to you that if you notice carefully the words of our worship songs this morning, many of them were directed to Jesus. You're singing about a guy who had a beard, about a guy with brown eyes, a guy with 10 fingers and some fingernails who usually got dirt underneath him as he walked around the dusty confines of Palestine, who wore sandals. I can see his crusty toes now as he walked from place to place. He walked a lot of miles. I can see him. Can you see his toenails? I don't know how they cut toenails in the first century, but he had to sit there and peel his. I don't know how it works, but he's a person. And I'm saying we're going to put him right now because we could. We could go to heaven. We can't, but it's conceivable. We could have, God, Christ shows up in the back room. We're going to pull him out now. Come on up, Jesus. And here he comes. Right? And he's in a real body, wearing his robe. I don't know what he's wearing. Maybe a suit now, but there he is. And I say, okay, fire up the songs. Let's go. Here we go. Going to worship again. And you're going to look at a physical form. And what we're going to do is what we've done already this morning. And we are going to say that we worship him and glorify this image, this person. Do you see how revolutionary that is? Do you see how amazing that is? And by the way, what seems to be even more amazing is make him that little baby that the Magi came to worship. From the very beginning of the narratives of Jesus' birth, we have the pattern that if Jesus shows up in your neighborhood, you better go worship him. And you and I need to recognize that's a wild thing. Now, some of you don't think that's so wild for one of two reasons. Either your view of God is way too low and it needs to be put back in a biblical place. And if you have trouble with that, you need to get books like A.W. Tozer's Knowledge of the Holy or something like that to get your focus back on a God being so incredibly transcendent and so majestic and so incomprehensible that you stand in awe of that God. Or your view of Christ is like maybe his ministry, he was just some translucent spirit who kind of, you don't really picture him as real. You don't picture him as having to, file his toenails down. But he did. He got the hiccups. He got indigestion. It's a baby he spit up. You realize we're talking about a real person here, but he's God. Now that, either your view of the humanity of God is not real enough, or your view of God is too low, because if your view of God is very high and your view of the humanity of Christ is very real, you know what you'll say when I tell you that Jesus, who could sit on this stool this morning, who now is somewhere seated at the right hand of the Father, is a real person, but he's also God? You would go, wow. And our natural response would be to unreservedly worship a person. We're worshiping a person. Not just a God who dwells in unapproachable light, some invisible spirit God. We're worshiping a person now. And it ought to be clear. It ought to be clear by the lyrics of our songs. That's why every cult group and every false religion out there that doesn't understand that Jesus is God ought to be gasping and appalled when they walk into a church like ours. Because we're singing songs of worship to Jesus. What? You don't worship people. You never are allowed to worship people. If they're just people, you don't worship just people. In the New Testament, when Paul and Barnabas came to Lyconium and they thought they were gods, right? They thought it was Zeus. They started to worship him. You know what Paul and Barnabas did? Tore their clothes. And they said, don't you dare worship us. We're just humans. Angels. When John was so overwhelmed in a moment of weakness and bowed down in Revelation chapter 20 and worshiped the angel that was giving him the revelation about the end times, do you know what the angel said? Don't you dare worship me. I'm just a fellow servant of yours. You don't worship people. And yet Jesus made outlandish statements like this. Turn to John 5 with me, please. John chapter 5. Jesus said something so incredible as this. John chapter 5. Jesus is talking about the great authority that the Father has, the first person of the Trinity, the one who dwells in unapproachable light, the transcendent, incomprehensible one, has such authority that he speaks a word, so to speak. And out comes life, out comes worlds, out comes universes. Well, it says in verse 21, for just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, he can do that. Obviously, the Father has all authority. It says, even so, the Son, a person that they're looking at who needs food and sustenance to eat, who's dressed like them. The Son gives life to whom He is pleased to give it. That sounds like incredible authority. And you tell me you can give life? Moreover, he says, the Father judges no one. He has entrusted all judgment to the Son. The Son is so empowered. He is so God that the Son, who's, 5'10" and a half, whatever, 170, is going to bring every person before Him and one by one judge the peoples. He will judge them. And that incredible authority and that sharing of responsibility in the Godhead ought to be so compelling that, here's the purpose clause, verse 23, that all may honor. Give me another word for honor. Worship, glorify, that all may honor or worship the Son. Well, you can't mean like worship, the kind of worship we give to God, can you? Yeah, just as they honor the Father. Do you understand what we're saying? That people that would ardently worship the Father, and we can picture them on some mountain meditating against the backdrop of some beautiful sunset, saying, Father, Creator of the universe, we worship you. That kind of attitude and worship ought to be before the feet and the sandals of the one who grew up in Nazareth. And it says, just as you honor the Father, honor the Son. So much so is this a mandate upon us that the last verse, or the last sentence in verse 23 is, he who does not worship or honor the Son does not worship or honor the Father who sent Him. Don't give me this cult garbage about Jesus being just a great prophet. He is demanding worship from us. And you don't worship a person. You don't worship Daniel or Ezekiel or Jeremiah or Moses or David or Solomon. You worship God, and you worship God only. Exodus 34 said, you shall not worship anything but God, the only God. And Jesus comes on the scene and not only accepts it, He requires it. And when the disciples worship Him in John after the calming of the sea, no problem. They're cool. He's cool with that. As a matter of fact, in John, 8 or 9, where the blind man gets healed, he comes back to worship Jesus. And he doesn't say, oh, no, stop that. You should worship God only. You know what he says? Finally, they're starting to see. He says to that blind man, and he's not talking about the rods and cones and photons being translated in his mind. He says, finally, I've come so that the blind can see. And then he turns to the Pharisees who will not worship him, and he says, you guys, still blind. You're still blind. And they take great offense to that. As a matter of fact, they killed Jesus because he made himself out to be God. The whole idea was in a body which no one could comprehend, Solomon would build a great temple. It would make this place look like just a piece of junk. Here's this majestic edifice in Israel. He stands back in 1 Kings 8 and he says, well, I know God can't really live here. I mean, God doesn't live he's too transcendent for that. He's too transcendent for the most expensive, the gaudiest building in all of the ancient Near East, and yet he lives in this container 5'10". Yeah, that's the amazing thing. And if you ever run into him, you better bow down and worship him. Philippians 2 says that he has not regarded equality with God, the majesty of that existence in this unapproachable light. That he doesn't regard that as a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself. He made himself nothing. He's being found in the form of a servant, found in human likeness. He humbled himself, even to the point of death on the cross. More on that in the weeks to come. But the text says because of that, God bestowed on him the name, the majesty, the willingness to accept honor, the credibility to be one to be worshipped. He said that is above every name. The name of Jesus. Every knee should bow, those in heaven, on the earth, under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is, what's the next word? Lord. And that's a big word. I know sometimes in the Greek language it means sir, but most of the times it means God. Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And this invisible spirit will somehow stand back, cross his arms in some way, and smile at that. When we all recognize, even those condemned to hell on their way to judgment, that they recognize that that person is encasing deity. Oh, don't get through Christmas and look at a nativity set and not stop and go, oh, wow, God became a baby. Whew. Whew. I mean, that makes UFO stories look, like light by comparison. God became a baby. Yeah, that's what Christmas is all about. If God became a baby and lived on this earth for 33 years, the thing that we need to note, which is obvious, is that it didn't happen recently. It happened 2,000 years ago. So because this happened 2,000 years ago, God visited earth, and all the, obviously our calendars now, you date your checks by this event. The coming of the focal point of history is Jesus showed up, which means God visited the planet. That this is now, if it's the focal point of God's working in history, it needs to become our focal point. In other words, if Jesus came 2,000 years ago as God in human form, then it needs to become the focus of our study. That means we need to become historians. We need to be focusing on a 2,000 year ago, 33-year span. It needs to be our obsession. I put it this way in your outline, number 2. Not only should we unreservedly worship him, if he is really the image of the invisible God, we ought to intently study him. He needs to be studied in his context, and we need to focus on that. Now, a lot of us in high school, we didn't like history class, right? But I'll tell you what, if you're a Christian, you have no option but to become enamored with history. We need to know the context in which Jesus came, a little bit about the Roman Empire and the occupation of Palestine. We need to know a little bit about all the things that surrounded it, and we need to know a lot. As a matter of fact, we need to know everything there is to know about that person. It needs to become our studying obsession, our hobby, so to speak. It ought to crowd out every other thing we do, is to know what that whole 33-year period of life was all about. And of course, the emphasis and the spotlight in the Gospels is on the last 3 years. We ought to have that down cold. We ought to be so focused on that. That ought to be the focal point because Christ is the focal point of God, you see. The word in our text in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15 is the word image, and it translates a Greek word that you'll recognize. The Greek word is icon. Icon. Now, you're familiar with that word, right? I don't know if you've ever gotten into your computer and torn apart a hard drive. Maybe it was fried, or maybe you just like tearing apart good stuff. But you've torn apart a hard drive and looked at a hard drive. You'll recognize that hard drive pancaked all these little, circular discs, one on top of the other, with this arm goes through and reading heads on top. If you look at it, you're not going to see much. Matter of fact, you look at it right, you might see your face. But you don't see much. And if you could look at it really, really close, you would start to see, what you'd see is little tiny pits and grooves. And what you would see, if you knew what that was all about, is that they represent either ones or zeros. And you got a bunch of ones and zeros that occupy this, and they're just like, ugh. You're not going to do much with that. It's just a hard to, but see what happened was those wonderful guys over at Windows who ripped off some great ideas from Apple, what they came up with was an idea that we can turn all this mess into something people can see. It won't just be lines of code, and it won't just be command. We'll put what on the desktop? Icons. We'll put icons on there so you can see what is represented on that disk. As a matter of fact, and if you want information about what that icon represents, then you just, right? You double click on that, boom. And you can translate this mess of incomprehensible ones and zeros and pits and grooves, and you can turn that into something comprehensible. But, the way to get there, on the Windows platform at least, is through that icon. See, the idea in the Greek text here is that Jesus is the icon of God. You want to get to that incomprehensible, transcendent, hard to figure out spirit that dwells in unapproachable light, then He'll give you an icon to click on. His name is Jesus Christ. And He lived 2,000 years ago. And the focal point of God came down to Palestine right there. Can you, if you're 2,000 years late for that event, could you now become a historian and live there mentally every day? You ought to just be obsessed with the study of that. We ought to intently study everything there is to know about Christ. We ought to study His miracles. We ought to study His teaching. We ought to know the sermons He taught. We ought to know the things that He did. We ought to see how He resolved conflicts. We ought to see how He picked leaders. We ought to see how He dealt with leaders. We ought to see His values lived out in what He did. We ought to study everything there is to know about Him. That's why we're so big here at PCC on reading your Bible. You've got to read your Bible. You've got to read it all the time. And that's why we just don't read the Old Testament. We don't just go through it chronologically. We've got to keep you in the New Testament every day because Christ is revealed there in the New Testament. And the Gospels in particular, we should focus and just absorb and eat up Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John because there we have the raw material. The icon is there. We can read His biography. Are you obsessed with that? You ought to be. That's God. He showed up and lived here. And if He was God, then we ought to be obsessed with learning everything there is to know about what God's life looks like when it's lived out in Palestine in a human body. What is that like? Study it. When I was a student in Bible school, I wasn't much of a studier, and I was taking the crash course and learning how to study. But I remember beginning of every semester, I had what we called syllabus shock. And syllabus shock was the syllabus, which was the class schedule and all the projects and assignments laid out on the syllabus. They would hand them out on the first day of class. And of course, you had a week of, oriented with all your new classes. And that week was just always just, I can't believe it. Just all this work and all these papers. Well, syllabus shock was one day taken to a new height in my life when I went to Dr. Stevens' Life of Christ class. Now, the Life of Christ class, I thought, this will be interesting. This will be good. And in your syllabus, first couple of pages are required textbooks, required papers to write, things you got to do, reading schedules and all that. And then oftentimes they gave you class notes, which oftentimes were, 10, 15, 20 pages stapled to the syllabus, and you could see what you were going to cover. Dr. Stevens walks in, and as I recall, it was like on a dolly. He brought in this stack of paper like this high and started peeling off like 5-inch thick, sections of this, go boom, boom, boom on everybody's desk. And I remember going, oh. And then I looked at it, and it was like 10-point font, single-spaced, like it was this big. My Bible's sitting here like this, and the stack of papers are like that. And I'm like, can I transfer out? I'm dying. Thinking, we can't possibly do this. And it was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class. You love those. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, a stack of papers this high, and we're going to get through it all in one semester. I remember dreading that. I remember going out of Dr. Stevens' class like this, going, what am I gotten myself into? I dreaded that class. But by the end, me, like a lot of people in the class, we were thirsty for more. Because we started recognizing that analyzing everything that Jesus did, looking at every opportunity, every situation, every circumstance, every narrative He ever taught, every parable He ever gave, every healing He ever accomplished, every miracle He ever performed, and really looking at all of those one by one, it was like, give me more, give me more. By the end, we were all wishing the class lasted for years, and we wished that we had more to read on this, because this was an incredible thing to start to learn about God in human form, what God looks like when He lives out a life in a real person. It was amazing. If some of you are, you've been around the block a few times in the Christian life, and you've never read the life of Christ in chronological order, you need to buy the Harmony of the Gospels. If you don't have one, buy one. And just sit down and read through the life of Christ where all the Gospels are laid out side by side in chronological order, and give yourself to that task. Read all of them. It's like reading Christ's life in, Dolby surround sound, You'll get all of the perspectives on it, and you can move from the time he was conceived all the way to the words just before he ascended back to the Father. Read through that. If you don't have that, that's a good $25 investment. Buy a harmony of the Gospels. And if you think you've really looked at this from every angle, then you need to start buying some classic works on the life of Christ that will help you see this from new perspectives and get new angles on this you've never looked at before. If you've never read Alfred Erdesheim's 850-page work, The Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah, buy it. We used to have some in the bookstore last night. I'm sure they're all gone now, but you can find them. It's been around forever. And that book, man, look at the things that Christ... If that's not enough, buy John Lang's 4-volume, 2,000-plus page work entitled The Life of Our Lord Jesus Christ. And recognize that you could give yourself for the next 6 months doing nothing else but eating and sleeping and reading about the life of Christ. And the more you do it, the more you'll want. Because the more you'll recognize this is what it's all about, the life of Christ. Because he is the icon of the invisible God. You want to know God? Click on him. You don't understand what I'm saying? Jesus said, if you want to know the Father, you got to know me. He said, when you know me, you know the Father. Study him. You got too many hobbies in your life, you're watching too much TV, you're reading too many magazines, cancel your subscriptions and get into the life of Christ. That's where it's at. Study him intently. You study him intently, one of the things that's going to happen, it's going to dawn on you if he's really the icon of the invisible God, if he's the visible manifestation of God, if he's the manufacturer and architect of life coming to earth saying, watch how it's done, guys. You know what's going to happen naturally as a response to that? You're going to want to do it the same way. If he is God, the manufacturer saying, guys, you want to know how life works? Watch me. Because he said it all the time in his ministry, didn't he? So you want to know how to love? Love just as I loved you. He would say things like in the middle of a party when people are enjoying everything at the party, and he would say, you know what, people need to be served here. He would take an apron on, he'd kneel down, he'd take the dirty, dusty feet of the disciples, and he would wash their feet. And then he'd stand up and say, just what you've seen me do? He said, you go and do the same. I'm not talking about washing feet. That would be out of vogue in no time. But the issue was, you want to know how to serve and love people? Watch how I do it. As a matter of fact, jot this reference down. Matter of fact, no, let's just turn there. 1 John chapter 2. This is a good passage for us to recognize. That the third thing we've got to do is not just worship him, that's obvious. And not only study him, and that's something we've neglected, isn't it? But the third thing we need to do on your outline is that we need to consistently imitate him. Because he is the architect of life. Write that down, number 3, once you get to 1 John 2. We need to consistently imitate him. We need to live like him. We need to find out how he does life, and we need to do it the same way. Here's what it says, and I want to say this to you in a way that might include you in the verse. And it's convicting when you do it this way, but look at 1 John chapter 2, verse 6. It says, whoever claims to live in him. Is there anybody here that claims to live in him? I mean, is there anybody that says, yeah, I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Christ, I'm one of his disciples? Is that right? If you claim to live in him, then you have a requirement right here. What is it? Then he must walk as Jesus did. Now, we're not talking about how he saunters into a room here. We're talking about how he lived, his behavior. You must replicate his life then, wherever you are. Now, we're 2,000 years later. That's a long time from then. Yeah, well, you need to glean from his life, and you need to live it out now. In our world, in our society, in our culture, you need to replicate. You need to walk as he walked. How did he do it? That brings us to, it seems to be a pretty popular fad in our day. Bracelets, bumper stickers, Bible covers for our teenagers. WWJD, what would Jesus do? Big fad, lots of these bracelets. You see them all the time. What would Jesus do? Some of you think a bunch of youth pastors got together and figured this out, in the late 90s to help keep our kids out of trouble or something. It has nothing to do with some recent new idea. It is what the Bible has been saying all along. As a matter of fact, the phrase itself came as a subtitle of one of the most popular books written in 1896 called In His Steps by Charles Sheldon. If you've never read that, that is a good Sunday afternoon read. It's an easy one. In His Steps by Sheldon. Sheldon writes in this story, a fictitious story about a church, much like ours, who decides, through a strange turn of events in chapter 1, to decide to pledge that they as a church and as individuals would never do anything for the next year, for one entire year, without first asking the question, what would Jesus do? It's the subtitle of the book. In His Steps, what would Jesus do? And this fictitious story in Sheldon's book tells us all of the implications of this little church and its pastor when all of the people, including the pastor, start to live life in a brand new way, which is they will not make a decision at work, they will not make it for their ministry, they will not make it for their lives or their families until they ask the question, how would Jesus respond? Now again, this is so tied to step 2. Like in the book, in chapter 2, there is a gal who stands up in the middle of the meeting, and she says this to Pastor Maxwell. She says, I'm in a little doubt as to the source of our knowledge concerning what Jesus would do. Who is to decide for me just what he would do in my case? It is a different age. There are many perplexing questions in our civilization. How am I going to tell what Jesus would do? And that's a valid question. And Reverend Maxwell in the story says this to her, rightfully so. He says, there is no other way I know of except that we study Jesus. We shall all have to decide what Jesus would do now after going to the source of that knowledge. And the problem with the fad today is you got a lot of people, including non-Christians, asking the question, what would Jesus do? And they have no concept as to what Jesus did. And you and I need to recognize that point 3, living consistently like God in the human flesh, is not going to happen without studying what he did. You and I need to become experts in what he did so we can live now as though we were him. The point is this. When you spend time at 6:30 or 7 in the morning studying in the Gospels the life of Christ, and maybe at 10:30 in the morning in the office when you have a decision to make, and it's a tough one, and you say, okay, what would Jesus do? You'll have something to draw from. Because you'll know how Jesus responded in a tough situation when he had A and B as options, and you can say, how would Jesus respond here? Or when in your workplace you're offered a promotion and you know these things are attached to that promotion, how would Jesus decide that? Or if you're thinking about getting another job and you're thinking, what kind of decision should I make? Well, what would Jesus do in this case? Or if you're dealing with a spouse and you're saying, man, this is tough, you need to ask yourself the question, how would Jesus respond if he was married to your spouse? Or if you're facing some kind of crisis in a relationship and you're saying, this is hard on me, and you're trying to make some decisions about that, you stop and ask yourself the question, how would God, who lived out life in human form, do this? How would Jesus do it? Or you receive some windfall of resources in your life and you're deciding how to save it or spend it or invest it. You might ask, you know what, how would Jesus respond if he got this windfall? The story, In His Steps by Charles Sheldon, spells out all the implications of this little sleepy church that gets woken up by that simple question. Now, all the theology isn't solid, but the bottom line is it transforms their life. They get to the place where they recognize how they're living just by being churchgoers is a lot different than how they live when they really ask the question about their life, relationships, and business, what would Jesus do? And a lot of them in the story lose their jobs. A lot of them have all kinds of relational problems and misunderstandings, but all of them, by the end of the story, they all recognize the joy and gratification and contentment of beginning to live life the way the Maker designed it to be lived. And you know that's God's purpose in your life anyway, right? In Romans chapter 8, he says his endeavor in your life is to conform you to the image of his Son. So what would his Son look like in the college that you go to, or the high school classes you attend, or the seminar you got to go to this week, or on the business trip that's scheduled for next month? How would Jesus respond in those situations? That's your calling, to be conformed to the image of his Son. The problem, even with Christians, as Paul wrote to the Roman church, is, though, in Romans chapter 12, verse 2, is we're constantly conformed to the image of the world, right? He says you're constantly being conformed to the image of the world. Don't be conformed to the mold that the world has, but be transformed. And to be transformed, back to chapter 8, means that I live differently. That means I live like Christ. I'm going to be conformed to his image. You know, that little tiny baby that was born in Bethlehem was really God in human form. We all ought to stop like the Magi and say, that is the image that I worship. That is the focal point of my worship. It also becomes the subject of my study, and it becomes a lifelong obsession to know the Christ of the Bible. And it also becomes the template for how I live. If he really is God, I want to study how he showed compassion. I want to study how he made decisions. I want to study how he loved people. And I want to purposely endeavor to volitionally choose in my life every day to try and live that pattern out. I have a 3-year-old boy and a 4-year-old boy. And they are both enamored and engrossed in Matchbox cars and Hot Wheels. That's the thing. They sleep with one in each hand. They can't let go hardly of, a Matchbox car to pick up a spoon. They're all over the house. They're into it big time. They're into it. Now, unlike their mom and dad, who enjoy the larger, more expensive counterparts to those little things. They're content to play all afternoon with a $1.25 die-cast metal car that's only this big. But let's just say, after church today, I decide to be really generous to my 3-year-old going on 4. And I say, man, I've got this windfall of money, and I'm going to drive up to the Mercedes dealership up off the road, off of whatever it's off of. I don't go there very often. And I get off at that, where the fleet's parked. You know where it is. Rows of those big, polished hoods. And I walk in and I say, give me a big one, pal. I want a big black one. Give me a big black one, heated seats, video monitors in the dashboard. Give me all the bells and whistles. I want, orchestra sound. I want everything. Give me big Mercedes. Big. Black. And so I lay down the money, I pay the check, they sign me up, and I bring it home. And I drive it in the driveway. And I just power up the stairs. I say, hey, Matthew, I got something for you. Yeah, what is it, Dad? I say, look out the window. It's in the driveway. And then I throw the keys at him, and they bounce off his chest. Yeah? I say, it's for you. I got you a Mercedes. You know what he'd be wondering? Is there a Matchbox car in the glove box? Because the heated seats and the video in the dash, he doesn't care about that. He has no interest. He can't drive it, right? His feet can't touch the pedals. He doesn't want to be in his car seat. He doesn't even want to be in a car. But if I were to go by Walmart and buy him a little, 3-inch, 99-cent one and bring it home, oh, Dad, wow, you're the greatest, all over the house, all afternoon. You see, the problem with God is he is so incomprehensible. He is so beyond any kind of imagination we have. He's an unfathomable and transcendent being. But one day, in his infinite wisdom, he put God in a form that we could identify with. He put God in something we could get our arms around and we could enjoy and we could worship. And something that made sense to us in living out the design of life. Something we could study and something we could replicate by our behavior. God has done that in the image of Christ. And the miracle of Christmas is it all started in a little manger in Bethlehem. Don't let this Christmas season go by and yawn your way through one of the most outlandish doctrines of the New Testament. God became a baby. Let's pray. Lord, forgive us for the countless Christmases that we've walked by the nativity sets, the manger scenes. We've looked at the cover of the Christmas cards and it hasn't even perked our interest. We've looked at it as decoration. We've not understood that what those things represent. One of the most amazing facts of all, that God visited our planet and lived like one of us for 33 years. Unbelievable. That requires our worship. That demands our study. God, that compels us to replicate whatever he did, to live as he lived. God, help us this Christmas season never to miss that truth. Help us to always be like my 3-year-old boy, to be enamored, engrossed, to be fixated on the image of God that we've been given. Jesus Christ. We honor him and we pray in his name. Amen.